I want to begin by thanking Malden Reads for their collaboration with us on this service and continuing to select books that challenge us and call us to consider different perspectives and this vast array of them. In a city as diverse as Malden and with its long history, this opportunity to engage with a shared book in so many varied ways is vital to our connecting with our neighbors and with each other. And it's truly one of my favorite services of the year. This is my 5th Malden Reads service, and I think it's the 7th year that we've been having this partnership. So I really appreciate that. One of our core values here at First Parish in Malden is that we want to connect with the city that we're in. And this is just one of the ways that we are able to do that. I was so excited to hear that Joy Harjo, the Poet Laureate of the United States, that her book, this book, was the selection for this year. I, along with many others, have loved her poetry. We've used her poems in service before. Poems like Perhaps the World Ends Here, about the reality of the kitchen table and its ubiquitousness in our world. And we used it as recently as October in our service, where we centered on the themes of food as ritual. But of course, the Malden Reads selection isn't about me or this church or my relationship with the poetry as much as it is about our collective relationship, not only with this poetry, but with the history of Indigenous erasure and Indigenous genocide, not only of human life, but also the cultural genocide and dismissal of the things that make us human in the lives of those Indigenous to this land by the colonizing forces of white Europeans. Ones that continue to this day in the land of Harjo's ancestors, as well as here in Massachusetts, in the land of the Pennacook and the Massachusetts and the Namcog and so many others. I don't know what I was thinking, but I wasn't quite prepared for how explicit Harjo is about the acts of aggression and violence her people experienced. I was expecting a book of poetry, and it is that, but it is also a personal story about Harjo's journey through her family's past, interspersed with narrative and historical documents that give us a fuller picture of the context from which these poems are written. Harjo's story, that of her family, her father's Muskegee, also known as Creek heritage, her mother's Cherokee heritage, began far before that original meeting where we hear of Andrew Jackson's terrible Indian Removal Act, which is just one of the many atrocities committed by our government in the white supremacist colonization of the land that was not ours to take. And I say this as a descendant of white European New England Puritans, both spiritually, as that's the legacy of this congregation, and biologically, as my mother's side of the family who grew up in New England and in America, the American side of my family. But when I read the words in this book, and I read the words about this Indian Removal Act, I tried to imagine what it would be like, but I can't. I can't imagine what it would be like to be told by a government that wasn't originally mine that I needed to leave behind my house, my stores, my rituals, my book, my church, following across, forced to migrate east to west like the sun rises across a place I didn't know. What Harjo emphasizes for me through her music and poetry is the reality of this cultural genocide that continues, that can never be erased. You can hear it in the poem We Bred Bourbon and Blues about how she and her ancestors are considered wild, a term that equates Indigenous people with animals, a tactic long known to dehumanize people. Her language so clearly reminds me of the words spoken in my own colonial home country of Canada, of my father's ancestors and of my birth. Many of you know that I'm from Canada, but what you might not know is how much Canada struggles with this history of human and cultural genocide as much as the United States does. Like here, the assimilation of Indigenous people is one of our original sins. And children, specifically, were taken to boarding schools as they were here because they felt that Indigenous people could not be trusted to educate their children in the superior white ways of being, the less wild ways of being, the civilized ways of being. In Canada, they have a saying that they say here, we've got to kill the Indian to kill the child. Words I've heard here as well. So it's not possible to overemphasize how truly terrible this practice was. If you can imagine your children being taken away from you because your way of being, your culture or food, your religion wasn't civilized enough, taken away and taught a different language. This attempt to assimilate truly was a cultural genocide, both in the United States and in Canada. The Trail of Tears, or one of the trails of tears, as Harjo reminds us, that continue to this day. This Trail of Tears, because history isn't on one linear path, one story, one people, five people, the five civilized tribes, there's that word again, that were forced to be displaced, but it's also the individual stories of 60,000 people displaced across land to the West. So as a white kid growing up in Canada, I don't remember learning much beyond colonial history from my colonizer perspective of our, or should I say my English and French ancestors, not of what happened to those who already lived here. Perhaps those European ancestors needed some ways of living to survive. Perhaps they needed some of the ways of the Inuit up north. But the vast majority of European Canadians live within 20 miles of the United States border. So here's what I remember learning about First Nations people when I was in school. In grade 6, we were told, let's do a project on your roots. All of us are from another culture. My teacher said, well, if you're Native, come see me and we'll figure it out. Because of course, the default was not that you were Native, but colonist. And I remember one girl in my class being singled out because her family didn't come from elsewhere. My mind blown, her story expressed in class as lacking a subliminal message, an aggression, that without ancestors from elsewhere, it was she who was lacking culture. Never mind that it was because of this exclusion, because of this cultural erasure perpetuated by everyone else. That's all I remember of this learning growing up. So this is to say that as I was reading this book and learning about the Trail of Tears, that I didn't know very much about it. And it maybe wasn't just because I was educated in Canada, because I wonder if our lack of learning about this would have been just as bad there as well. But as I read up and learned about this Trail of Tears, or these Trail of Tears, I learned that this Indian Removal Act moved 5 tribes that were called the civilized tribes and others, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Muskogee, and Seminole. They were named the civilized tribes because they had adopted some of the Anglo-European practices. If you can put the map up. So Harjo has this in her book, and it is the map of the trail, one of the Trails of Tears, she says. It's the one that is talked about most, which goes from Alabama to Oklahoma, right? So these 5 tribes sometimes are now called the 5 tribes of Oklahoma, though it was not traditionally their home. All right, you can remove that now. Thank you, Luca. The many ways in which these tribes came to be considered civilized were because of things like their adoption of Christianity, their ability to read and write in English, and their forms of centralized government. And they lived in the southeastern United States. These tribes lived closer to where whites lived, and so they adopted some of the practices that made sense for them through intermarriage. President Washington said that he believed that indigenous people were biologically equal, but culturally inferior. Let's make them more like us, he said. Can you imagine coming into a land and saying, you need to be more like us? I guess that's what colonialism is, a kind of, if you can be equal as long as you erase who you are and be us, an assimilation. But even that was, of course, not enough. As the white Europeans started to spread out, so too did their desire for land. And they began encroaching on all the indigenous folks who lived east of the Mississippi. And so they were told they had to move. The Cherokee resisted, and then they were forced out. 7,000 soldiers marched on their lands and homes and towns of the Cherokee Nation, rounding them up at gunpoint in their homes, some of them being put into internment camps where some of them died. About 4,000 people of the Cherokee Nation eventually died during this forced removal from a variety of causes. Both of Harjo's ancestral lines were part of this removal. Her poetry in this book is imbued not only with that grief and pain throughout these lines in her poem, like, if I turn to salt, it will be from the petrified tears, from the footsteps of my relatives as they walked west. And we are still in mourning, and grief is killing us. Anger is tormenting us. Sadness eating us with disease. And I grow tired of the heartache of every small and large war passed from generation to generation. And my mother had the iron pot given to her by her Cherokee mother, whose mother gave it to her, given to her by the US government on the Trail of Tears. And we were corralled like horses, like captives, like slaves. We were anything but horses and captives and slaves. And the past rose up to meet us and cried, and so many more. And yet this is not, despite all of this, this is not a book simply of grief, though it is so very present. It is a book of celebration and resilience of a people determined to continue with their culture, to survive even when they tell you you can't. Despite the Trail of Tears, despite the cultural assimilation that was forced upon them, despite, as Harjo reminds us in her book, that until 1978, it was illegal for Native citizens to practice their culture. 1978, until Harjo herself, current poet laureate of the United States of America, was 27 years old. This includes making and sharing of songs. She writes, to write or create as a Native person was essentially illegal, a little over 40 years ago, in the lifetime of people at this service and in this room. So thank God for the gift of these poems and these songs that truly celebrate and honor the fullness of Harjo's life as an Indigenous person, that words that we have this privilege to hear, because it could have not been so. Now, I am no poet, nor am I an Indigenous person of these lands, of this America. My ancestors traveled no trail of tears, not that I know of, at least. And I didn't know how much of what I don't know how much of what I learned. I didn't know how much of what I learned in reading this book and in doing this research about it and in listening to Harjo's album that she just released, A Prayer of My Enemies, that has a lot of the poetry from the book, An American Sunrise Set to Music. I didn't know how much I would learn in this book, that she had such a love for music. And so following this message, we're going to hear some words spoken from Harjo, her own spoken words to a poem, An American Sunrise, one of the final poems in the book, to music, set to music, because she is also a musician. And she writes at the end of her poem, it's been 40 years later and we still want justice. We are still America, we. This could mean a lot of things. And one of the things I think it alludes to, being that it was written in 2018, is the passage of the act that allowed the Indigenous to create their art, their culture, their language. Who could blame her for having to have her very lifeblood of music and poetry deemed illegal for so much of her life? Who could blame her for wanting justice for the Trail of Tears and the residential schools and so many other acts that made her culture illegal? So when I read this book, I think about the gift Harjo has given us by letting us see her art next to the realities of her people. And I moved to think of the ways, big and small, that we can halt this culture of erasure here in our own land that is not really our own. So my homework for you, because there's always homework, is to listen to the Indigenous voices from where you live, the land you are on, and support the work and culture of this, to apologize, to make restitutions, perhaps pay reparations. And so with that, let us listen to Joy Harjo in her music, An American Sunrise.